Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of All Things Policy. I'm Aishwaria Sonavane, your host for today and research analyst for Pakistan Studies at the Takshashila Institution. As you already know from the topic of today's episode, we are diving into one of the most pressing and misunderstood issues of our time, migration. Whether it's the movement of people in search of better economic opportunities, escaping conflict or climate shocks, or simply the pursuit of better and a more secure life, migration is shaping geopolitics, societies, and economies. Joining me to unpack this complex and deeply relevant subject is Danish Zahoor. Danish, welcome to All Things Policy.
Thank you so much.
Could you take a moment, Danish, to introduce yourself and the work that you do?
Right. So I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Leeds, where I'm researching migration and labor rights in the context of UK agriculture. While this topic is very niche, I have my eyes on the larger conundrum of migration globally. That's my focus of research, and I'm really glad to be here, to be invited to this podcast today.
Thank you so much. Let's jump right into it. When we talk about migration, a lot of popular discourse tends to revolve around refugees or asylum seekers. But what often gets overlooked is the fact that labor migrants actually make up to nearly 2/3 of the global migrant population. Danish, could you help set the record straight here? What are some of the most common misconceptions about migrants and how do they shape public attitudes and policies?
Right. So when it comes to dispelling the myths around migration, I would like to touch upon an earlier point that you made while introducing the topic about climate shocks, war, conflict, in a way pushing people out of their homes, out of their native lands, and displacing them, making them move to safer havens. In reality, that is not the case. In reality, we do not see a bulk movement of people, a mass movement of people overseas across oceans. And the reason is that human societies have a degree of resilience towards disasters. Human societies do not simply pack and move when disaster strikes. I know for a fact that there is a tendency to believe that, here's a few million people living in these coastal areas, and when the flood comes, all of these people will pack and move. In reality, that does not happen. In reality, human societies adapt. There is a lot of emotional and also pragmatic investment that human societies have to their native lands. And when the disaster strikes, they have the ability to cope with it. They have the ability to adapt. So whether it is war or climate shocks, climate change, the common myth is unfounded in terms of the fact that people move en masse. That doesn't really happen. That doesn't really materialize. So that's the first myth that we need to dispel. The second point you made about labor migration. Labor migration is the biggest, most significant chunk of global migration. When I talk about labor migration, I'm referring to those people who are not in the typical white collar band, These are people who are coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds. These are people who have limited educational abilities, limited skills, and yet they are a significant human resource for countries across the world, including and especially the developed parts of the world, where they work in agriculture, construction, a lot of unorganized sectors. But the unfortunate part is that they do not form a part of the research discourse so much. They're not studied, they're not examined, their cases are not examined as closely as white collar skilled migrants are. That's a problem, that's a gap that we as scholars need to bridge going forward. So that's something that we need to be mindful about. And these workers actually, these migrants have their own unique risks, in the sense that given their limited abilities, given their limited awareness, they are more prone to exploitation. They are more prone to risks that otherwise well aware, a well educated migrant would not face in developed world context. So yeah, they have special risks, and yet they aren't spoken about as commonly as we would like to see in popular discourse and even in research work. And one of the most common patterns that we are observing these days is the vicious cycle of remigration, in the sense that these workers, when they go to developed countries, they are not able to accumulate enough capital or skill to reintegrate into their home countries. What that does is that they have to keep remigrating. Unlike high skilled workers, they have to keep remigrating to the developed parts of the world. They're not able to accumulate skills, they're not able to accumulate enough capital. So they get trapped in this vicious cycle of remigration. They're essentially doing the same work in different locations with zero upward occupational mobility. There are some of the unique problems that low skilled labor migrants are facing globally. And yeah, they're not spoken about a lot.
Interesting. I think in one of our interactions, you spoke about how migration occurs from developing countries to developed nations. So, in many developed countries, we've seen a sharp rise in anti immigrant sentiments, which is often framed as a backlash to globalization. So, from your perspective, how do you interpret this backlash? What does this tell us about the evolving relationship between globalization and migration? And if these sentiments continue to influence policy and public discourse, what could this mean for the future of global economic integration?
Well, to get the facts straight, what is the percentage of migrants globally? It's not more than 4%. It's around 3.6 to 3.7%. A very small number of global population are migrants. And this is not enough. This should not be enough to bring about massive political upheaval or widespread political change or sentimental change. But that's what the reality is. What we are looking at today is enormous amount of footage, enormous amount of attention given to migrants coming in from developing countries to developed countries like the US. The reason is that a lot of these countries are trying to focus on migrants to, in a way, hide their own failings. These governments who have not been able to provide enough opportunities, enough avenues for their own populations, find it very convenient to blame the migrants for all of these socioeconomic problems. The second reality is that many of these developed countries realize that they have, in a way, lost out on the game of globalization that they were earlier during the early 1990s, 2000s. They were earlier very vocal about after the collapse of the socialist Soviet Union. They have in a way lost out on their own game to a large extent, and with the offshoring of factories, with the movement of factories across the seas from the US to China, Indochina, there have been a lot of job losses, and all of this is, as we understand, is a result of rampant globalization. So migrants do come across as a soft target. They are an easy and convenient target for politicians. A lot of times, symbolic measures like building a wall, that feed into this popular discourse, that feed into this, a panicky situation. Building a wall really is a political act. Now think about it. What happens when you build a wall? You're physically trying to stop migrants coming in from Mexico. But most of these migrants, They're just flying into the US. They're losing their legal status as by overstaying in the US,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how they turn illegal, rather than trying to cross physically through the border. And now they've been and being stopped by a huge formidable wall. No, that's not how most of the migrants turn illegal. They turn illegal by overstaying. The wall is not necessarily a solution to that. The point that I'm trying to make is that building walls or involving yourself in gestures like these are very symbolic. These are very political in nature. These can evoke
Mm-hmm.
sentiments, but they do not necessarily solve the problem. So when you talk about global integration or the future of migration, migration will continue to be the reality of our times. It'll only grow with the passage of time. It cannot be abated, at least not in the near future. This is something that will increasingly become the reality of our time, facing us very directly. And
Mm-hmm.
as we'll talk about it ahead, states do not necessarily have the resources to pull the plug on migration.
Right. That's a great segue into my next question, where I want to talk about the migration policy itself. Um, do stricter migration policies actually deter people from moving? I'd love for you to elaborate on this, perhaps comparing how these dynamics play out in the West versus in the Indian subcontinent. Are we seeing different patterns emerge in these regions pertaining to migration?
Like I said, states do not necessarily have the resources or the kind of inspectorates to be able to curb migration. The state departments are often undermanned. But what states do really is, with stricter laws, when you create stricter laws as a government, what you're essentially doing is that you are vulnerabilizing the migrants. You're making them more vulnerable at the hands of unscrupulous employers. As soon as you make stricter laws, you are ensuring a larger chunk of the migrants falls into the unorganized sector, into the underground sector of your economy, and falls prey to the actions of the unscrupulous employers, and becomes more vulnerable to exploitation, becomes more vulnerable to harassment, poor living and working conditions, sexual harassment, even to some extent. So, all of these things, while they do not directly deter migration, they increase the risks that migrants are facing at the hands of different agents, including their own employers or landlords. With regard to the comparison between our own part of the world, the South Asian context, and the developed world context, um, in the South Asian context, again, the state is even less competent to be able to curb migration. But with other factors like religion or the inherent tensions, race or ethnic tensions, linguistic tensions that are prevalent in South Asia, they can actually kick in. They can actually
Mhm.
affect and shape the whole phenomenon of migrants. We know the kind of responses that Rohingyas generated in India,
Right.
in especially given the kind of political atmosphere that we are living through. So it does bring in different sorts of anxieties in our context, but the common reality is that stricter laws do not necessarily deter migration. The migrants find their ways into countries, into different economies, especially the more prosperous economies as compared to their own home countries. Um, what stricter laws do, however, is that they make the so-called illegal migrants more vulnerable.
Right. I want to get back to the concept of globalization and migration, something that you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago. Dr. Laila Simona Talani, a professor of international political economy, has spoken about the so called dark side of globalization and migration. She points to the challenges like exploitation, cultural integration, widening inequality, and even the rise of transnational crime when it comes to these two concepts of globalization and migration. What's your take on this more critical view of globalization's impact on migration? And Danish, do you think these concerns are valid? How should policymakers respond to these so called darker undercurrents without reinforcing xenophobic narratives?
these concerns are very much valid, and they also form a huge part of the work that I'm myself doing in UK's
Mm-hmm.
agriculture. A lot of these laborers come from very poor or developing parts of the world, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, not necessarily very poor, but still, a lot of these countries are just coming out of the shadows of the decaying socialist system as it was in the past. But what we're really looking at is people from very low socioeconomic backgrounds, very little skill, very little in the way of education, few skills, absolutely minimum possibilities of occupational upskilling, occupational higher occupational mobility. And it is these people who are especially at the center of the so-called dark tendencies of globalization and global migration. What is needed on the part of policymakers is more research. Unfortunately, there is very little research on this aspect of global migration. There is a need for multidisciplinary research. There's a need of multi-stakeholder research. When I talk about multi-stakeholder research, I mean to involve all the actors that are at the different touch points of this phenomenon of global migration. For instance, some scholars have even talked about banks who have, in the past been trained, the staff has been trained and sensitized to deal with problems like terror financing, for instance. Why can't we really sensitize the same banks for issues like modern slavery or exploitation of people or human trafficking, in the sense that these phenomena generate similar kind of patterns? They generate patterns like late night transactions, multiple bank accounts in the name of the same person. So there are certain patterns, set patterns that phenomena like human trafficking or modern slavery generate. And actors like banks or stakeholders, even at the peripheries of this phenomenon, need to be sensitized, need to be roped in. They need to be involved when it comes to addressing these problems. And that's what policymakers should be looking at: a multi-stakeholder approach, a multidisciplinary approach to deal with these darker aspects of global migration today.
Very interesting. Speaking of that, in today's world, how do we understand brain drain in today's interconnected world? Firstly, for our listeners, could you break down what the concept of brain drain means? And yeah, all
Right.
yours.
Right. So, brain drain was a very popular phrase in the yesteryears, especially in socialist context. Like India was a socialist, continues to be a socialist country, uh,
Right.
but and brain drain was an idea that the country or the state is investing a lot of time and resources and effort on its human resource, on developing its people, its younger populations in terms of education, in terms of training. And when the same human resource in a way ripens, it just decides to quit. It just decides to leave the country and move to more developed parts of the world. US was a favorite destination for many years amongst Indians. Western Europe, probably even today. Um, what this does in effect is that all those years of hard work, all those years of investment completely go down the drain. So that's the idea of brain drain. You're trying to develop your brains, but with their movement to the more lucrative parts of the world, all of that effort is drained out. But today, this discourse around brain drain is sort of evolving. I won't say that there are no anxieties around brain drain any longer anymore, but in India, there continue to be anxieties around this idea. But what we are looking at is we're looking at an emergence of a unified global market, a unified global economy, where movement of people is taken to be a more mainstream reality, where people move across the borders, and even the sending countries, even the countries like India or countries from the developing world, see the movement of their own people to developed parts as beneficial through remittances, the money they send back in powerful currencies back home to their own countries, to their families, which sooner or later translates into economic investments. It also translates into bringing back technology, innovation when these people come back to their own countries. So there is value associated with migration, even amongst developing countries. There's a big an emerging field of study called migrant entrepreneurship. Migrants are presumed to be more energetic, more innovative, bringing in new perspectives into the developed economy, especially, and this results in their greater ability to create entrepreneurial ventures which are path breaking, which are fresh, innovative, and ultimately creating more economic value, greater economic value. So all of these factors are really changing the idea around brain drain. They're just mitigating to some extent the anxieties that were associated with brain drain earlier. This is expected to happen as the global economy opens, integrates, and we see the emergence of the so-called unified global market, which is free, which is open for participation by everybody, from people from across the world, from all regions, developed as well as developing.
Right. Thank you, Danish. This has been such an insightful conversation. And before we wrap up, is there any final thought or takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with when it comes to thinking more clearly and compassionately about migration?
Well, I think there's been a lack of nuance, and that's something that troubles researchers like me in migration. There's a lack of nuance. There's a lack of depth when it comes to migration. People need to view migration from a lot of different angles. When somebody migrates from one part of the world to another, it involves a lot of motivations. It involves a lot of drives, probably in their own home country or in their immediate vicinity, their family, or there's a culture of migration that has emerged. So there needs to be more study on that, into that motivation to migrate. The migrants' experiences coming into a different country varies across gender, across socioeconomic background, across educational background. So there's another reason why there has to be greater nuance when studying migration. So my point really is that migration is an emerging area of study, is an emerging area of research, and we need to look at a lot of different nuances more closely. We need to look at a lot of different factors, a lot of different variables that shape the experience of migration very closely, rather than paint it with a single stroke of the brush. So yeah, it's a very deep, it's a very intricate phenomena, more than what meets the eye, and it deserves deeper and closer attention on the part of researchers and policymakers alike.
Absolutely. And thank you for your contributions. I think your work will go on to add a lot of value to the study of migration. Thank you so much for joining us, Danish. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Don't forget to follow All Things Policy for more thought-provoking discussions on pressing geopolitical issues. Until next time, take care and stay curious.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.